Hi everyone, in this video of Accelerated Chess Dragon, we're going to be looking at a game played between Alexei Shirov and Alexander Grischuk. This was played in the 2001 Linares tournament in Linares, Spain, and without further ado, let's look at this game. Shirov starts the game off by playing the move e4 and c5 by Grischuk, so the Sicilian defense. Knight f3, knight c6, d4, c takes d4, knight takes d4, knight f6, and now knight c3. So we have the four knights variation of the Sicilian. e6, and now knight d to b5. And Grischuk here develops his bishop to b4, pinning the knight on c3, and maybe if this knight on b5 moves to somewhere other than d6, then Grischuk has the opportunity of doubling the pawns. Shirov plays a3, and now Grischuk exchanges his bishop for the knight on c3, and d5 by Grischuk. When you're a Sicilian player, d5 is the move that you always want to get in, and Grischuk managed to do it. So far the opening is going very well. We have some more development, d4, taking the knight to e2, and now e5. So cementing the pawn on d4, and perhaps trying to later play knight g4, maybe knight d7 could also work. So we have castles by both sides, and h3. Just a prophylactic move by Shirov, and Shirov is most likely going to get ready to play a move like f4 and launch a pawn assault on the center. And the idea of f4 is just to separate this e5 pawn from this d4 pawn. If the d4 pawn is not defended by any other pawn, then essentially it'll become an isolated queen pawn, which is what Shirov wants. So rook e8 was played, and before playing the move f4, Shirov plays knight g3. And he always has this interesting idea of playing bishop g5, and then f4, and then trying to open the position up. And if the position gets opened up, then also the f5 square becomes a square that Shirov can use to his advantage. So that's what he's trying to do with this knight g3 move. Bishop e6 was played, trying to develop a piece, and now f4 by Shirov. And Shirov wants to open the position up, and maybe he could also have the idea of pushing f5 and just kicking the bishop back, but mainly he wants to play f takes e5, followed by bishop to g5. So before allowing that to happen, Grischuk plays e takes f4, and after bishop takes f4, in the worry that the move bishop g5 will be played, Grischuk just moves his knight back to d7. Queen h5, trying to get ideas of e5 in, and now g6. Queen h6, sinking the queen into the position, and queen f6. This queen f6 move is always giving the idea that perhaps queen g7 can come, and if Grischuk ever wants to trade queens, then it'll be favorable for him. So we have bishop to g5, making a reasonable discovery, and now queen g7. It's always very useful to try trading the queens here, because that can be a very good thing, especially when you're being attacked like Grischuk is in this scenario. And now if you think about what happens after queen takes g7 check is played, then after king takes g7, and then you bring the bishop back to d2, there isn't much attack going on. And you can see that Grischuk can just consolidate the position, and it's hard to see what Shirov was really trying to achieve by his queen being on h6. So instead, after queen g7, he plays the queen to h4. He wants to keep the queen, and in general, he wants to keep the attack going. So here we have knight ce5, and it's trying to not only get rid of the d3 bishop, but also just trying to bring the knight into the center. So we have bishop to h6, attacking the queen, and also trying to perhaps get the queen away from the g7 square. g7 is the square where the queen is essentially defending the entire position. So if the queen can go away from that square, or at least become a bit less active, then that'll be a plus for Shirov. So queen h8 was played, and now a very nice move by Shirov. He plays knight f5, and knight f5 is not only threatening knight e7 check in this scenario, but it's also just trying to open the position up. And if you ever imagine playing g takes f5 as Grischuk, then the position could get a lot worse. For instance, you can imagine that queen g5 check would be played, knight g6, and now e takes f5. And after e takes f5 is played, there's an attack on the bishop, there is potential threats on the g6 knight, and it'll just sort of start to break the position up more. And this will just end up terrible for Grischuk, so he doesn't capture the knight. Instead, he captures the knight with the bishop, which may seem kind of better considering that you don't immediately open the position up, but it's essentially the same thing because the position will get opened up no matter what you do. So e takes f5, and now we have a trade on d3, and the queen comes to e5, which is quite good because the queen was kind of doing nothing on the h8 square. So rook to f4 is played. You might be thinking, why not just crash through on g6 with f takes g6? Well, white seems to be doing well after the move f takes g6, but in reality it doesn't seem to have accomplished anything. For instance, after h takes g6 is played, how do you exactly continue? You might be thinking of playing a move like bishop g5 and perhaps even rook f6, but those moves really aren't doing much, and these moves don't seem to find a good way of winning, because the queen can just go back to g7, and even though the pieces are flooding the king side, how do you deliver a direct punch? That's the problem that Shirov is facing, and hence the reason why he doesn't play f takes g6 and allows perhaps the queen and maybe even the rook to get included in the defense. You can imagine what would happen if rook e5 was played and trying to transfer the rook over to the h-file this way. So we have the move rook f4, kind of being a bit patient and getting ready to double the rooks on the f-file. Knight c5 was played, and now rook af1. And rook af1 basically comes with the idea that if you play f takes g6 now, it's a lot more deadly. So knight takes d3, capturing a pawn, and here not moving the rook away because the knight is attacking it, but instead playing f takes g6, which is a very bold decision. And the idea is that if you play knight takes f4 here, then white is simply winning after the move g takes f7 check, and after king takes f7, just a simple bishop f4. And if you are black here, I don't see a good way for you defending against all the threats that are present in the position. First of all, there are a ton of discoveries for white if you move your queen to a dark square. Secondly, there is an attack on the h7 pawn. And thirdly, this rook, if unleashed by this bishop on f4, is just going to crush the entire position. So knight takes f4 is not a very good idea. Instead, what was played in the game was f takes g6, just acknowledging the fact that the position is kind of getting worse, but maybe Grischuk can handle it. Although now it's a bit too late for that. Rook f7, and the idea is quite clear here. We can see that rook g7 is a threat, trying to, of course, check the king and include the other rook in the attack. Knight c5 is played, and now rook g7 check, king h8, and rook f7. And here you might be thinking, well, there's possibly a way of getting out of this. Why not play the move queen e1 check? And I encourage you to pause the video and find a good response to queen e1 check if you were playing the white pieces. Okay, so if you were playing queen e1 check, a move that I would really like to play is king h2. And this move works based on the fact that all of white's pieces are striking at the king. Let's say that you capture the queen on h4 because there's really nothing else to do. Then there is rook h7 check, king g8, the rook on f comes to g7 check, king goes to f8, and now rook h8 is checkmate. This would be quite unfortunate for Grischuk. But there aren't any other options that would really help you. For instance, if you try to play queen e5 check, there could just be a move like bishop f4. And even though you do have queen takes g7 here, it isn't exactly the best, because after rook takes g7, king takes g7, and now bishop to h6 check, the d4 pawn is under attack, and with that, the king is also very exposed, so it's hard to see how you can really improve the position from here on. So instead, we have the move knight e6, which is a move that is very hard to play, especially when you realize that you're being crushed. So here, rook takes g6 was played. You might be wondering why rook takes h7 check wasn't played instead, because it looks very good. I mean, you're attacking the king now, but after king g8, how do you exactly continue the position? Yes, you could check on g7 with your other rook, but what difference would that really make? You're still winning, that's true, but Shirov has a better way of ending the game. And let's see how he does it. Instead of playing rook takes h7 check, Shirov decides to go for rook takes g6. And his idea is to open the king up and essentially use that to his advantage. After rook takes g6, it's not advised that you play h takes g6 because there is the simple bishop g5 check. And here you must move your king, and after queen to h7 check, this is actually checkmate. So instead of capturing the rook, d3 was tried, trying to maybe get the other pieces involved in the defense of the pawn queening. Rook g4 was played, and this actually sets up a very neat trap, and after rook g8, Grischuk unfortunately fell for that trap. So I encourage you to pause the video and find how you would win here as Shirov. Okay, so here the winning move is rook takes h7 check. And why is this winning? It's because there's absolutely no way to defend now. Because if you play king takes h7, then it doesn't matter where this bishop moves, it's going to be checkmate. For instance, let's say the bishop moves to g7. It's going to be checkmate since the queen must block, and then queen takes h5 is mate. And even if the bishop moves all the way to c1, this will still lead to checkmate, mainly because of the power of this queen and rook. So, hence, after the move rook takes h7 check was played, Grischuk resigned the game, and a very nice victory for Alexei Shirov. So, I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you have any suggestions or feedback for me, please let me know in the comment section, and stay tuned for more chess.